Welcome to episode 11 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that'll help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, or in the case of today's episode, a retired school librarian, this podcast has something for you. Earlier this week, I had what could best be described as a happy surprise late at night when typically no good can come of scrolling through Twitter. I found an article Hincks wrote for Knowledge Quest, posted on November 13th, titled The Glass Half Full, Focusing on the Positive. I'll attach a link in the show notes. After attending my presentation, Live Your Best Library, Kelly wrote her takeaways, the 5 ways she would apply some of what she learned to her library. This was by far the nicest compliment anyone could give me. It is fair to say that no presenter ever wants to waste somebody's time. So to find out, not only did concepts from that presentation resonate with someone in the audience, but those ideas were internalized and applied to one's own library. This was incredibly validating for me. I've always thought of myself as someone who loves to learn and share, but this presentation really put me outside my comfort zone, and there are always risks, but a potential for something really positive and impactful to happen when you do try something new. In keeping with this episode's theme of lifelong learners, I wanted to share some of my own learning when it comes to ordering books. My fall orders recently arrived for 2 schools, and I'm reminded of a few items worth passing along. I was disappointed to learn, when before inspecting the boxes, that my invoices indicated that 15 titles had been backordered for one of my schools and 12 titles had been backordered for another school. Had I followed up with a phone call to customer service sooner rather than later, I would have discovered that one title, the same title for both buildings' orders, was unavailable, and that was holding up the entire follow-up shipment. This is easily rectified. Move that title to your spring order, authorize the remaining books to be sent out, and close that order with the business office. Outstanding orders are something that everybody wants to resolve. And I had been waiting for one book, and there were almost 30 books that were not sent to me right away because it wasn't available. Lesson learned. I also wanted to share some purchasing accidents which I have made over the years. I've learned from these, and this can happen quite easily if you purchase things sight unseen, for example, from a company, rather than handling books at a book fair or purchasing them at a friend's library book sale, or something which is becoming rather uncommon, a bookstore. However, upon further inspection, many of these so-called purchasing accidents were actually books in my collection which I inherited from a previous librarian. So these quote-unquote accidents are really just me deciding against purchases willfully made by somebody else who was in charge before me. Admittedly, I have a binding bias, and there are just some items which, in my opinion, have no business being circulated. So here they are in no particular order. First of all, books which include a CD, either audio or otherwise. DK Eyewitness used to do this with clip art, and I think increasingly that's uncommon, but these were some older books I had, and somebody had kept the CD in, which had subsequently been lost, and my students now are always asking, where's the disc? Where's the disc? Thinking that it's a movie they can watch. And when I explain to them that it's not, they lose interest. But the cover of the book says there's, a disc inside, which of course confuses everybody. Books which have tabs. This is perfect for at-home enjoyment. It's a great book to own if the book has tabs, either to receive or give as a gift. But in a library, it doesn't have the durability to withstand repeated checkouts. The book I'm thinking of in particular is a fantastic book which my children all enjoyed, my own children, because they received it as a birthday present. And that was Meanwhile by Jason Shiga. And it boasts 3,856 story possibilities. It's a wonderful book. The problem is that there are tabs on the edge of each page directing the readers in a choose-your-own-adventure format. But when the tabs wear off and they get torn, I really don't have an idea of how to repair this book, other than what I've done recently, and that is to purchase new copies. Books with fold-out pages. This is never a good idea in a library. Anytime the page folds up or it folds out, it never gets folded back the correct way, and when somebody doesn't fold it back correctly the first time, subsequently it becomes worse and worse, and invariably these fold-outs become decrepit looking, and I usually end up trimming them off. Another problem that I have with books which circulate are ones which have inserts or envelopes with letters or maps or mirror pages for reading codes. The books I'm thinking in this case would be like Piratology or Wizardology. Anytime you have letters or postcards, such as the Griffin and Sabine trilogy by Nick Bantock, this is really a difficult thing to keep track of because invariably some of the inserts go missing, and unless you're willing to take an inventory of each pocket each time a book is returned, at some point these things go missing. When the pieces go missing, kids don't want to check the books out anymore. Another thing I've learned to avoid when it comes to purchasing accidents are books that have trading cards or playing cards. The ones I'm thinking about in this case would be 39 Clues. The 39 Clues, many of them came with trading cards or cards that would help you play a corresponding online game. And with these cards not being circulated, or by the time I was there, the books had lost their cards, the kids lost interest and figured that you had to have the cards in order to enjoy the books. While Lego books are exceedingly popular with my readers, I really try to avoid any of the Lego books which have action figures included inside the cover, as this creates a problem for my students. I have always avoided including pop-up books in my collection, and when I do have them, they have been used for story time or as a center for students when they are either done checking out or they can't. These would include the pop-up books by Robert Sabuda and a favorite of my students, which is Wide Mouth Frog, and I use that to teach sequencing to my kindergartners. Oftentimes, my issue is not so much with the content, but as I mentioned before, the format isn't consistent with my organization of my collection, and this leads to a problem. Mini books, which I mentioned briefly in the episode regarding dwarsliggers, mentioned in the last week's episode, or the DK pocket books. This is a problem. The Beatrix Potter or the Nutshell Library by Maurice Sendak. I'm rapidly coming to the conclusion that there is a just right size, because when books are either much too big for the shelf or much too small, the shelving becomes a real issue. And having a tiny book spinner on a table is one solution, but it's not ideal. Spiral-bound books, as is used in many cookbooks for kids, is conceptually a really good idea because the book lies flat when you want to use it in the kitchen. Except when the spiral pulls away from the binding, I have yet to figure out a way to repair such a thing. And oversized coffee table books, or the life-size animal books, the Titanic cross-section books, these are so enormous, and the kids are all fascinated because they want to check out a big book. Unfortunately, shelving it makes it difficult, and invariably these books are dropped more often, I find, than others. A purchasing mistake I've made repeatedly can be touted also either to enthusiasm for a new title, combined with a rather hasty grab without inspecting a book more carefully. And these books tend to be the interactive books. Basically, they're activity books which kids can create by filling in the pages with their own information. Sometimes there are writing or drawing prompts, and I've usually had to reimburse my library for all of the following books because those books would become incorporated into my own library at home once I recognized I'd made a mistake. The first one of these was Tom Engelberger's R2D2 Guide to Folding and Doodling. It's an activity book, and I didn't realize it at the time when I purchased it. On more than one occasion, I have purchased a Big Nate activity book and also had to remove that from the collection and pay my school library back. The Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which has a beige cover, it's a do-it-yourself book. And I think I just quickly grabbed that when I was at Sam's Club one year and got home and realized, oh, this is not going into the library after all. I won't make this mistake, but Raina Tegelmeyer's Share Your Smile is an activity book which is going to be released in April of 2019. And when I saw that, I was wondering how many impetuous folks would grab it for their collection only to realize, oh, this is an activity book. When I prepare for a podcast episode, I'm amused at how many tabs I have open on my computer. My Google Keep is filled with items I've been collecting and assembling, and this is a wonderful unexpected discovery I made, that this podcast is as much about what I'm learning as it is about what I have learned. So episodes allow me one day to explore library displays in Belgium, and another episode which takes me back to my undergrad classes at the University of Michigan School of Education in Ann Arbor when I was 20 years old. Join me today as we tackle the issue of lifelong learners. At a recent professional development training, everyone attending was given the charge to do something new. Because learning is a permanent change in our behavior, how readily do we embrace change in order to learn something new is the fundamental question. It's a very basic request made of all of the district employees, which caused me to consider why some individuals find new information to be threatening and why other individuals embrace this new information. Lifelong learners, like us. The presenter had asked us, how do we respond when we're confronted with new information? Do we avoid the information? Do we assimilate the information? Or do we accommodate the information? Because I'm a lifelong learner and apparently a forgetter of Piaget's Assimilation and Accommodation, I got to use Khan Academy to brush up on something which I'm sure I heard in a lecture almost 30 years ago. Assimilation, and this is, by the way, a link I'll include in the show notes, is when we try to fit new information into our previously held schema. And this is the reassuring feeling that we get when new information connects with prior knowledge. We feel comforted because while it is new, it is also familiar. However, if we have to change to incorporate that new information, that is accommodation, which is much harder and might result in some pushback by an audience. So do we, school librarians, inherently view learning differently than other educators? Do we embrace change, thus necessitating the need to continuously learn more readily? Anecdotally, based on the school librarians I know and I've met over the past 12 years, we tend to be very proactive and, out of necessity, extremely resourceful in recognizing the need to either adapt or become irrelevant. I know plenty of teachers who have never diversified their degree, either going into speech or special education or educational leadership or counseling, and have remained in their classroom forever. My aunt, who inspired me to become a teacher in the first place, taught in the same building in the exact same room for 37 years. While I can't apply the same standard across all 50 states, in the state of Michigan, in order to be a school librarian, we have to have both a teaching certificate and a master's in library and information science. And so most of us come to this job with some traditional classroom experience. I don't know a single school librarian who became one out of college. I had nearly 10 years of classroom experience before I went to library school. I do know many school librarians who have changed schools, moved to different districts, switched from elementary to middle to high school and back again. Our K-12 state certificate affords us this flexibility, and the district's fluctuating budgets and their vision means that school librarians have to adapt or leave. My own personal journey has been detailed in several previous episodes, but I found library school such a fantastic departure from the School of Education classes I had taken previously. I was thrilled I could do something that was so interesting and yet not have to leave the school setting. I recognized 10 years into my teaching career that my interest in being a high school social studies teacher had stalled. I knew I had no interest in becoming an administrator or a counselor, and then I met Carla. Carla was our librarian and my hero. I had been drowning in teaching numerous classes, and as a probationary teacher in the district, I was feeling the ever-watchful eye of the administrative team. Carla supported my lessons, and she didn't judge me. She didn't evaluate me. I wanted to be Carla someday, and she is the reason why I registered for my first class at Wayne State University, Library and Information Science program in Detroit. Because I have yet to figure out the logistics of conducting an interview, I sought feedback from fellow school librarians online. I posted a question on the American Association of School Librarians discussion board, and I would like to admit I recently just joined the American Association of School Librarians, and I have been trying to rationalize why it has taken me this long. If you listened to my episode on assistants, you would have heard about my frenetic first year as a school librarian. And yes, frenetic is the best way to describe my first year as a school librarian. Frenetic, adjective, fast and energetic in a rather wild and uncontrolled way. Synonyms: frantic, wild, frenzied, hectic, fraught, feverish, fevered, mad, manic, hyperactive, energetic, intense, fast, furious, turbulent, tumultuous. Thank you, dictionary.com. I was just trying to stay one step ahead, and the idea of having anything of value to contribute to my national organization during these first few years was laughable. What I failed to comprehend was that belonging to my national organization would support me as I learned the ropes and gained my footing. It seemed I always had an excuse for not joining my national organization. I was either too busy, or I was barely keeping my head above water, or 5 years ago I switched jobs, and that was a whole lot of extra work, and it just seemed like I always had an excuse not to. What follows is the post which I made on the American Association of School Librarians discussion board, and then the subsequent responses that were submitted following that post. So approximately 4 to 5 days of feedback, and I'd like to share that with you right now. My original post said, parentheses, full disclosure, end parentheses, I am working on an episode for a podcast, parentheses, School Librarians United, end parentheses, what was your journey to becoming a school librarian? Were you a classroom teacher first? Did you go directly into library school? How long were you teaching? And then I cannot believe I asked this question. How old were you when you decided you wanted to be a school librarian? It turned out to be a good question, but I'm embarrassed that I wrote that down. What influenced you the most in your decision to become a school librarian? Did you work in a library while you were in library school? Thanks, Amy. Anyway, what follows is a wonderful assortment of responses from people from all over the country, and this was such a happy surprise. I want to start with these two responses because they're sort of like bookends. One is a retiree, and the other one has been in the job for 2 months. And I have feedback from people everywhere in the middle. This response was from Stuart. And Stuart has a wonderful story because he entered the field of education at a time when I think certificate and certification programs at the state level were in flux. And he indicates he was at some point in his career an instant teacher, which I would love to hear more about because becoming an instant teacher sounds like an adventure. And Stuart talks about having some teaching experience as an English teacher and then taking some opportunities which led him into becoming a library media specialist. And I especially like the phrase that Stuart used, which is by fortunate coincidence. So many of these stories that were relayed to me in this conversation were fortunate coincidences. Individuals who found opportunities and took those chances. And I think that as lifelong learners, it really speaks to the type of personality of somebody who's willing to take those kinds of chances. And Stuart, in taking this fortunate coincidence when an opening appeared close to where he was living, turned into a 40-year career. And he retired this past year with 50 years in education and as a librarian. And I think that's a wonderful story. A delightful contrast to Stuart's experience is one submitted by Jenny. And Jenny has shared that she was a parent volunteer in her children's school and that she enjoyed being in the library so much that she wanted to pursue becoming an elementary school librarian. And similar to my story, decided to tackle library school while having 3 children. And I can relate to trying to balance library school with very young children. I also enjoyed that Jenny shared that she had to sub before she got her school library position. And as somebody who subbed for over a year before I was able to find a teaching position, I can relate to this experience. It is fun to know that Jenny's been a school librarian for 2 months now, and she loves it. And I'm excited for her journey to continue. Julianne wrote about her experience becoming a school librarian. And prior to becoming a librarian, she was actually a teacher for the deaf for 5 years and then decided to go back and get her degree, which she got while she was raising 3 children and was in her mid-30s. Mary wrote from Texas that she had an interesting experience in that the only teaching she's ever done has been in the school library and that she didn't come with experience teaching in the classroom, which made her experience different from many other people who wrote in. I really like the response I got from Jill, and Jill writes about her rather unusual background in becoming a school librarian, and that is she was a historian for the National Park Service and has a master's degree in public history, which I found to be very unique. She also is a good example of someone who took chances based on volunteering for a school committee. Her experience with school library is in a charter school, and so the library didn't exist. And only after she decided to apply did she then complete her master's in library and information studies and worked in this charter school for 15 years as a school library media specialist. I love the story that Melissa from Connecticut told. She had been a classroom teacher for 12 years and had decided that her inspiration for becoming a school librarian came from the pride that she had in her own extensive classroom library and the joy that she had in matching her students to the books that they would read. She became, out of opportunity, the, quote, resident library in an informal capacity because there was a grant issued to build a school library because there wasn't one in her school. And she was inspired to become a librarian as she became more involved in that program. Melissa's journey also describes how her job and opportunities changed as budgets were imposed and her program was cut. She also says that as she has moved from job to job, she has a new position and she's been there now for 4 years. And, quote, "I feel as though I'm doing what I was meant to do." Jamie from Dallas tells a really interesting story about being disillusioned with the classroom after being a teacher for 4 years and becoming inspired by a professor who was a former librarian. I really love what Jamie shared with me, and I'll quote it right here. "I thought it would be a good fit," meaning the degree in library science, "because a major reason I wanted to become a teacher was to share my love of reading and grow that in my students, as well as encourage them to explore their own passions and creativity." Continuing the quote by Jamie, "Becoming a librarian was exactly what I needed. As a librarian, I am still able to teach like I always have wanted, but without the constraints of a classroom teacher. I am able to work with the students to not only find books they connect with, but to build their critical thinking skills, draw on their interests, and inspire their creativity." End quote. Nicole wrote of her experience in becoming a library media specialist, and I love it because it really does exemplify that we are lifelong learners. She obtained her degree at the age of 51, which is fantastic. And I love her story because she talks about the importance of having a mentor when she was making these decisions and getting her degree. I want to spend a little bit of time focusing on Joan's story. She had been a classroom teacher for many years. She is now retired, and she wrote a very compelling story. But I found it especially fascinating because at some point while she was a teacher, she was assigned to be the, quote, social studies teacher in the library, which is absolutely fascinating because there wasn't a librarian in the library anymore. So this teacher had the library as her classroom, if I'm reading this correctly. And she said that she couldn't stand the disarray and how sad the neglected bookshelves had looked. So between her classes, her lunch, and her prep periods, she would be sorting and weeding the collection, which is fantastic. She earned the designation of teacher assigned to the library, and at that point was pursuing her master's in library studies. And I think it's a wonderful example of what happens when lifelong learners are given opportunities and they take them. And there aren't always happy endings. Sometimes our positions end, sometimes our budgets are cut. And Joan talks about her successes and that she was a school librarian for 15 years in a school where she taught for a total of 37. She had won awards for her library program, and her school, despite its 90% poverty rate, was still regarded to have a very impressive library. And I do want to mention at this point because Joan does share with me that once she left, her program did end. And I do think that librarians are similar in the respect of, say, an elected official, that once we leave our libraries, our legacy and the success of our program is something which we have a very limited ability to impact. Similarly to an elected official who leaves office, some of their legacy may cease. And I think that that's something that's very hard to recognize, but the reality is it shouldn't change the fact that we have a phenomenal opportunity to have an impact while we are there. And that is enough for me. I appreciate Joan sharing this because I know that on some level it's very disappointing to find that when you leave a program, many times your hard work isn't continued. especially like Reagan's story because not all of us started off as school teachers. And Reagan describes getting a bachelor's degree in zoology and learning that she loved to research because she had been a research assistant in school. She had also become a veterinary assistant. And it just seems like throughout her beginning career, she tried lots of different things. She said something very interesting here. That changed when I began volunteering in an elementary school library. And more than one respondent talked about volunteering first. And it was an opportunity to get more experience and test the waters of working in a school librarian. And everyone who said, I worked in a school librarian as a volunteer, then became school librarians and pursued their degree. Reagan shared that she discovered it would take extra work to become a school librarian versus a research librarian. And in spite of that, she chose to do that. And it exemplifies, again, this attitude of being a lifelong learner. And she said, quote, I'm now in my 9th year as an elementary school library media specialist. My journey here had lots of twists and turns, but I'm loving every minute of it. Janet from North Carolina told of her journey to becoming a school librarian, which began when she was a French teacher initially and ESL teacher for, if my math is correct, 25 years in Vermont before moving to North Carolina to become a teacher. And she responded to a suggestion that due to a shortage of school librarians and her personal background, that she should become a school library media specialist and get a degree. And, I think that that's really fantastic because somebody suggests, hey, this might suit you. And when that opportunity was presented, a lifelong learner is going to take it. The story Alex tells us about becoming a school librarian started as an administrator of a preschool and working on what was described as the humble school library collection in the preschool, which had been available for the students and run by parent volunteers. Alex then took over organizing the library once those parents graduated and their students left the school, and, quote, without knowing what I was doing or having the vocabulary for it, I, and this is Alex speaking, organized, cataloged, and weeded the collection. As I got to know the collection, my partnership with the faculty increased and my relationships with the students deepened. I began to see what kind of potential impact I could have at a school in this role. So at 30 years old, off to graduate school I went. End quote. Thank you, Alex, for that story. Patrick in D.C. described a rather frustrating struggle with trying to piece together part-time work after obtaining a library media specialist degree. And this is the reality that many of us face in having to service multiple schools in order to be full-time. And he used the word, quote, fried, fed up, and disheartened. And I understand that struggle. And it does, unfortunately, put us in the position of having to be creative and sometimes not knowing what our job will look like from year to year. Kristen in Michigan had a very interesting journey because she went to library school immediately after undergraduate degree. She also is very unique in that she obtained her teaching certificate after getting her library degree. I only know of one other person in my journey who has decided to go to School of Ed after becoming a librarian. Everybody else I know has done it the other way around. And I think that that's wonderful because she said, quote, I love children's literature, and I think that is what made me go into school libraryship. I thought it would be the best way to influence children to step outside their comfort zone, to read new and different books. I wanted to help every student find their perfect book. She also had an interesting experience because she worked in a bookstore while she was in library school. The next observation that Kristen made is especially compelling because she begins honestly. And I think that that is something which everybody who has submitted feedback to this post has been doing, is being extremely candid with their feelings about their job. Kristen describes becoming disenchanted, largely because her teaching responsibilities have overwhelmed the love of maintaining and working with her collection. And I can identify with this because my primary responsibility to my students is to teach them. My collection time and non-instructional time is so limited that many of my, what I consider librarian responsibilities, have been delegated to somebody else, like a library assistant. Jane is one of the retirees who chose to chime into the conversation, and I really appreciate her perspective. I'm especially fascinated by what she's done once she's retired. She says here, quote, "I've been retired for 13 years, but I still volunteer each week at a local elementary school media center. I also spend 3 weeks a year volunteering at a small library on the Amazon River in Peru." I think that's wonderful. And I don't want to wait till I'm retired to go work in Peru. I think that would be a fantastic summer activity. I am finding the feedback from the retirees especially inspirational because they're looking back on a very fulfilling career as school library media specialists. Lee wrote that in his personal experience, he actually had to approach the principal about a position as a library media specialist because he didn't have the certification yet, but he did have enough credits to get a provisional license. And I think that that is very telling when people take a chance and know that they could very well be shot down. Lee worked as a middle school librarian for 6 years, a high school librarian for 22 years, and also worked at the district level for 4 years. And I think that that's fascinating that you have that kind of willingness to move from level to level. It's not easy to do. Lee also spoke about being involved in AASL as a board member and serving on committees. And even though Lee is retired, still working for library services several days a week and teaching professional development courses. Quote, "I just can't let the world go yet," unquote. Finally, Deborah, who is an adjunct professor in library science at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, had described her journey in becoming a library media specialist and working in a small public and academic consortium library. And I find this fascinating because all of us have different journeys, and it's not always apparent where it's going to lead. So it's hard to say if all of these stories have happy endings, but I will say that it certainly does establish that school librarians are indeed lifelong learners. I would like to take this time right now to thank every single person who took time out of their busy day to reflect on their journey and to share it with me today. My lifelong learning has resulted in a new career and in this podcast. And as this is the week of Thanksgiving, I would like to say how incredibly happy I am to have this community of listeners and the opportunity to grow as a school librarian. Thanksgiving is always celebrated at our house, and I'm going to spend next week enjoying my family. I hope you will also have time to be with friends and family. Look for our next episode on December 2nd. Thank you very much. If you found today's podcast helpful, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Share this podcast link with other school librarians in your district and your PLN. Consider leaving a ratings at iTunes as it helps other school librarians learn about this podcast. I would like to thank composer Nazar Ryback at hooksounds.com for the music you've heard today. And as always, I invite your feedback and contributions. Please email me at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. The topic of our next episode will be, honestly, I'm narrowing it down. I have an extra week to think it over, and it may be time to either tackle Wikipedia or collection development. Either way, I hope you will tune in.